There's a documentary called Behind the Curve in which a group of people who think the earth is flat decided to test their hypothesis. They spend something like 20 grand on a laser gyroscope and they run some tests. And lo and behold, they learned that the earth, contrary to their assumptions, is in fact round, it turns out. Their response to that was exactly what you'd expect. At first, they didn't want to believe it. They started rationalizing away the experiment. "We were taken aback by that," one of the men said. He added, "We obviously were not willing to accept that." Now, that documentary came out a few years ago. It was an interesting look at human psychology and how people respond when their own actions debunk their whole worldview. And I mean, literally their worldview in the case of the flat earthers. It's not an easy thing to experience. You know, it's one thing for someone else to prove you wrong. That's difficult enough. It's something else entirely to disprove your own ideology and to reveal how bankrupt and nonsensical it is. Now, it's easy to point and laugh at flat earthers, but this is a phenomenon that we are seeing more often these days. In fact, it's been playing out for the whole country over the past few weeks as proponents of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, have witnessed the complete implosion of the president of Harvard University, Claudine Gay. Now, this is a woman who personifies everything DEI stands for. She came from an extremely wealthy background. Her family runs the largest concrete plant in Haiti. She became the first black president of Harvard University, despite publishing only a handful of academic papers. And she did it all based on three factors: her skin color, her gender, and her willingness to smear and destroy all of her ideological enemies along the way. And in just a couple of weeks, she's been outed, as you know, as a complete moron and a fraud. She proved that she's incapable of answering extremely basic questions in Congress. She also demonstrated that she's incapable of writing anything without ripping off dozens of other papers. Now, given all this, the cognitive dissonance for the DEI crowd has to be overwhelming right now. I mean, after all, one of their holiest figures in their entire cult has just crashed and burned. She's provided irrefutable evidence that DEI rewards mediocrity and destroys every institution that embraces it. And that's difficult for these people to accept, as you can imagine. And that's why, in the wake of Claudine Gay's resignation as president of Harvard, there hasn't really been a debate over the merits of DEI or anything approaching a reasonable conversation, because the word debate suggests that two sides are presenting their arguments in a real and rational, a clear and rational way. But in this case, what's happening is that the anti-DEI side is making coherent arguments, while the pro-DEI faction can do nothing but perform and posture and vomit its emotions all over the place. They're actually a lot less respectable and coherent than even the flat earthers, because at least the flat earthers proponents have arguments, as flimsy as those arguments may be, but that's still more than can be said for the DEI defenders. Now, the spectacle that aired on CNN over the weekend perfectly captures this dynamic. It features two DEI advocates, one of them named Lulu Garcia Navarro, and then another one named Kara Swisher. And they're speaking with two male counterparts who are actually sane. There's Rehan Salam and Jonah Goldberg. Now, in this debate, Goldberg and Salam explain why DEI is a scam used to smuggle leftist ideology under the guise of diversity. The women on the other side of the discussion can only scowl and huff and repeatedly declare how infuriated they are by it. Lulu Garcia Navarro also interrupts constantly while demanding that the two men on the other side of the debate stop interrupting her, which they never did. So we'll play just a portion of this tire fire, which aired on national television. But before we get to the really disastrous part for the pro-DEI side, first, here's Salam making the reasonable case against DEI. You need to hear this first to fully appreciate the contrast. So here it is, watch.
Has, in effect, the country moved on from the so-called racial reckoning we were all talking about after the murder of George Floyd?
I think there is a broad sense that racial reckoning involved smuggling in certain really contentious ideological ideas that weren't ultimately about diversity, but rather were about imposing ideological uniformity. When you're looking at DEI bureaucracies, what really is noxious about them is that they actually don't respect all sorts of diversity, including viewpoint diversity, including the fact that, look, in some cases, you have groups that are overrepresented, and that can be okay. the point that J.D. Vance was making about the Dallas Mavericks is that it can be good and healthy and reasonable in some domains to have overrepresentation. And that means that underrepresentation can also be.
She said.
Well, you can say it's ridiculous. You can make that assertion, but fundamentally the fact that, I am one second-generation Asian American on a panel of 4. I am massively, massively overrepresented. But I think it's reasonable to say that you're going to judge people based on their merits.
Now, okay, put aside the inaccurate assertion from Chris Wallace that George Floyd was murdered. The rest of that clip is logical, level-headed, perfectly coherent. Now let's see if things remain on that level once the other side starts interjecting. Let's watch.
When you're looking at organizations that count that matter, that are high-performance organizations.
Excuse me. This is the burden, and I can't tell you how infuriating I find it. This is the burden that always comes with representation. The idea is that because you are a person of color, suddenly you are only there because it is some noblesse oblige. It is because some white guilt put you there because there was some DEI initiative, and you can't win either way you look at it. I mean, what infuriates me is you look at the whole Claudine Gay thing, and everyone's talking about DEI. This woman cannot win or lose either. If she is there,
I'm happy to talk about
no,
Claudine
let me finish.
Gay,
Let me finish. If she's there, it's because of DEI, that they put her there because she's black. If she loses and they kick her out, it's because she actually was never good enough to be there in the beginning, and you can't win in this situation. Yeah, and it is infuriating as a person of color to constantly have this cudgel put on our
I get
the
argument you can't win, but you also can't have it both ways. You can't celebrate and tout that someone was hired, and it's a wonderful thing to expand diversity, and Harvard went full tilt talking about how great it was to hire the first black woman, and then say all of a sudden...
The first black person. It wasn't even the first black woman. It was the first black person.
I don't care. The point is that she got caught obviously plagiarizing. And those are the facts that, there's this massive...
This was an ideological, very well-funded...
The motives of the attack don't change the fact that she plagiarized. And where I disagree with you, Kara, is when you say...
When somebody fails who's white and who's a man... Let me finish.
You mean like
when
the
someone who
president
fails... Yes. When someone... Nobody... In fact, there's books written about this. Fail and then come back. Look at Pivot. Exactly. Pivot.
Okay, so there's a lot of incoherence in that too. She was struggling to figure out what her point even was. Well, you can't win. You can't win or lose. I mean, you can't lose. You can't win. What can't you do? And then she says that if she's hired, it's only because she's black because of diversity, and then if she gets fired, it's only because she's a plagiarist. Well, yeah, I mean that's pretty much how it works with DEI. So that's the funny thing is that if it sets up a no-win scenario. Which, by the way, this didn't have to be a no-win scenario for Claudine Gay. If she wasn't a plagiarist, then she'd still have the job, But if it does set up a no-win scenario, it is DEI setting up that no-win scenario. When you start hiring people, because she didn't really make the point well, but you could make the point, although it's an anti-DEI point, that when you hire people based on their race and you tout that they're hiring because of the diversity and inclusion, then you have automatically created this sort of aura of suspicion around this person that they're not cut out for the job. Because if they were cut out for the job, then you wouldn't need to say anything about the diversity. You would just hire them based on the merits. If you don't hire based on the merits, then people suspect that, this person doesn't have the merits for the job. As we head towards a presidential election in November, there's one thing you can be sure of. 2024 will be a tumultuous year. How will your hard-earned savings fare? You will already see the impacts of inflation at the pump and the grocery store. The dollar continues to lose buying power faster than wages can increase. How are you protecting your savings? You got to consider diversifying with gold from the Birch Gold Group. For decades, gold has been the choice of investors and central banks to hedge against inflation. If you have an IRA or 401k from a previous employer that's just gathering dust, call Birch Gold and they will help you convert it into an IRA in gold. You're not going to pay a penny out of pocket. They'll simply convert that 401k into physical gold, which, unlike digital currency, cannot be tampered with. Just text Walsh to 989898, and Birch Gold will send you a free info kit on gold. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, thousands of satisfied customers, and the exclusive gold company of the Daily Wire for the past 7 years, you can trust Birch Gold too. Text Walsh to 989898 to claim your free info kit. That's Walsh to 989898 and secure your savings now. So again, if it's a lose-lose scenario, it is one that DEI sets up. But the whole segment goes on like this. The women just keep shouting about how horrible it is to assume that Claudine Gay was a DEI hire, even though Harvard's policy for generations now has been to elevate mediocre candidates on the basis of their skin color. And then when it's pointed out that Claudine Gay plagiarized more than half of her academic writings, the response is to, just attack the motivations of the people who uncovered the plagiarism. But even if that's true, that the people were politically motivated in uncovering, it's still plagiarism. And what is her response to that when Jonah Goldberg points out that, whatever their motivations were, she still plagiarized? She says, oh, come on. Oh, come on. Yeah, but still, come on. They have no response but just to screech incoherently. And as with so many other debates on so many other issues, if you know nothing about the issue and you saw this discussion, right, you would immediately know that the women on the left are full of crap without knowing anything else. Because you can tell they bring nothing but their emotions to the table. All they have is their indignation and their feelings. If you ask them for evidence to prove their assertions, they'll say something about books that have been written about this. And this is why these people get in trouble for plagiarism so often, by the way. They don't know how to provide citations. They just say books. Well, where'd you get that? Books? I got it from books. Right? There's books about it. If you read one of their papers and there's a little citation mark and you go down to the footnotes, you look for where it is. It just says books. And again, all this would be clear to any observer who had no background knowledge about the subject. If you do have background knowledge, then it's even more obvious that these women on the left are full of crap. Now, on this issue, like so many others, the left has no intellectual leg to stand on. If there was any sort of substantive argument to be made for DEI, they would make it. They would produce evidence, for example, that institutions become more effective as they become more diverse and inclusive. They wouldn't just assert this as a fact, as they always do. They would show it, but they can't. Instead, they simply insist that their position must be true. And even if it isn't true, only a bigot would point that out. Because after all, pointing things out, noticing things, is the cardinal sin on the left. That appears to be their entire argument when it comes to the entire Claudine Gay controversy. They won't try to claim that Gay didn't plagiarize. It's clear that she did repeatedly so. Instead, they appear to be arguing that it was our responsibility to not notice the plagiarism or to ignore it once we did notice it because she's a black woman. Now, this is the total intellectual bankruptcy that you find on the left. And since the left controls all of our powerful institutions, this intellectual bankruptcy lies at the core of all of them. Now, this is the larger problem underlying the Claudine Gay debacle. The real problem with Claudine Gay's plagiarized papers isn't that they were plagiarized. It's the fact that even if they were original thoughts, they were still vapid and dumb and pointless thoughts. It used to be that Harvard presidents conducted original research on important topics like, biochemistry. But now they write useless garbage for a non-existent audience solely to advance themselves. And this is the part of the whole Claudine Gay story that you don't hear much about, but it's far more important, actually, than the fact that she lifted several paragraphs from other authors. It turns out that even if she hadn't plagiarized a word of her academic writings, Claudine Gay would still be a total fraud. So first of all, let's just look at the topics of all of her publications. Okay, every single one of them is about black people or equity in some fashion. And that's not an exaggeration. That's like the only thing she wrote about before she got this job. That was Claudine Gay's obsession. Her papers have titles like The Effect of Black Congressional Representation on Political Participation and the Impact of Gender and Race on the Politics of Black Women and the Effect of Economic Disparity on Black Attitudes towards Latinos. So this is what passes for research on diversity. It's the least diverse resume you can possibly imagine. It's all the same subject. It's like paging through a random author bio on salon.com. With a sole exclusive focus on black issues, Claudine Gay, for that reason alone, shouldn't have been in the running for any job anywhere in academia, but perhaps maybe a historically black college. Like, what was she doing running Harvard in the first? The only thing she cares about are black issues. It's the only thing she's ever written about, talked about, the only thing she even pretends to care about. But even for a historically black college, she would still be totally unqualified. Now, to be fair to Claudine Gay, in and of itself, maybe you could argue that this resume isn't necessarily disqualifying. If Claudine Gay had been writing truly groundbreaking stuff about gender and race and the politics of black women or whatever, then maybe you might be inclined to give her a pass on this singular obsession that she has on skin color. I mean, if she was actually saying something useful or interesting or unique or insightful about it, then okay. But the deeper you dig, the worse it gets. It turns out that Claudine Gay wasn't just a race-obsessed grifter who plagiarized whole paragraphs every now and then. In fact, the data behind Claudine Gay's papers, the information she was passing off as new and important, was garbage, which again is really a much bigger deal than plagiarism, as big a deal as plagiarism is. So let's zero in on one of the papers I mentioned a few seconds ago. It's called The Effect of Black Congressional Representation on Political Participation. This paper was published in the American Political Science Review all the way back in 2001. And it's an important paper because it's one of the handful of publications that somehow got Claudine Gay tenure at Stanford University before she moved on to Harvard. And the basic idea of this paper is that when black people get elected to Congress, they make white people want to vote less. And somehow this thesis made sense to Claudine Gay and everyone who peer-reviewed this document. And to that end, the paper contains all kinds of tables which point to data that supposedly proves this point, that whites just hate voting when black people are on the ballot. And that's the kind of discovery that would confirm that white supremacy is real and white people are bad. And so that's the idea anyway. So of course, both Stanford and Harvard loved it. And of course, it was too good for them to check. They loved the conclusion, so they didn't bother to check whether the data was any good. Now, the problem is that a few decades later, a researcher named Jonathan Powlison decided to look into the claim anyway. And he found that Claudine Gay's data contradicts itself. At one point, Gay's data tables show that Missouri Congressman Bill Clay's presence on the ballot didn't have much impact on voter turnout. But elsewhere, Gay's tables show that Bill Clay had a very significant effect on voter turnout, close to a 17% reduction in turnout, in fact. Now, put aside the fact that it's absurd to claim that Bill Clay, simply because he's black, would make white voters want to stay home on Election Day. The question remains, why do Claudine Gay's tables contradict themselves? Now, there's no clear answer to that question. Powlison couldn't come up with an explanation. Claudine Gay certainly hasn't offered one herself. And here's the really incriminating detail. Every time researchers have tried to look into this, Gay refused to provide the underlying data that she used to generate the tables in her papers. In 2002, two professors, Michael Herron of Dartmouth and Kenneth Schatz of Stanford, presented a paper that effectively debunked Gay's entire methodology. And they included this footnote, quote, "We were, however, unable to scrutinize Gay's results because she would not release her data set to us." That's pretty incriminating. But here's the really amazing thing. That footnote was removed from the final version of their paper. If you try to find and download the paper online today, you're not going to find any mention of Claudine Gay because it's been scrubbed completely. And instead, if you find the paper, you'll find that Herron and Schott debunk a hypothetical methodology without using Claudine Gay's name at all. It's almost like someone wanted to protect her for some reason. But writing for Jordan Scatchell's Substack, Chris Brunet got his hands on the first version of Herron and Schott's takedown, and the one that hasn't been censored or redacted in any way. And the full uncensored footnote calls Gay's conclusions, quote, logically inconsistent. It repeatedly calls out Claudine Gay by name. And it includes a lot of technical details which no one, including Claudine Gay, has refuted. Now, the point is that this is a far bigger scandal than Claudine Gay lifting some paragraphs here and there, as bad as that is. The fact is that her ideas and the data underlying those ideas were useless and fraudulent and apparently just made up. Her publications were race-based screeds that were only ever cited by a handful of academics, and those handful of academics very quickly proved that they were complete garbage. And yet, Gay somehow became president of Harvard, and documents criticizing the substance of her quote-unquote scholarship were scrubbed. And even now, she's still making around $900,000 a year as a professor. This is the state of Harvard University and American academia in general, and this is the key point. Yes, our intellectual elites are often thieves and plagiarists. That certainly matters. But what matters more is that they are just as intellectually bankrupt as they are morally bankrupt. They are charlatans at every level. And their power and influence is crumbling by the day. And based on their panic over the past few weeks, we can be pretty sure that they're aware of it. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.